So let's start with the 1050 Ti playing on the new Call of Duty Warzone Caldera map that, compared to the older Verdansk map, I think is a little bit more heavy on the GPU. And we can see here I have set the resolution to 1080p, but I have it at render resolution at 66%, so we are basically just rendering at 720p, and the settings overall are almost set to the lowest. And when it comes to the average frame rate on this run that I often do here to get a good benchmark to compare against other cards, we get an average of 69. That isn't bad, but when you get into areas that are a little bit more demanding, with like explosions, more people, a lot of buildings and such, you will have maybe more of a drops down to like 40 and such. And personally, when it comes to the frame rate here, I think it's marginal low. I can like play with it, but it's not enjoyable. And also the overall visuals when running at 720p, because of the render resolution, is like hard to make out enemies at the distance, especially on this map with all of like the trees and such. And the Warzone does have support for DLSS and not like AMD FSR super like resolution thing to sharpen up the image. So there's like no supported DLSS or for the 1050 Ti, so we can't make the visuals better. So then let's switch to the 3050 running at the same settings, 1080p rendering at 66% or like 720p, and we get an average of 128 plus. And I have to say the lows are also probably a lot better. And I didn't really finish the run because I got killed, and also it's not really like, when we get into these kind of FPS, we are actually more limited by the CPU, so we could actually get better frame rates here. And if we jump straight to Ultra in 1080p, actually rendering at 1080p, we can see that we get an average of 74 FPS, but it's somewhat like marginal. It's like the same feeling as playing with a 1050 Ti in 66% render resolution and lowest settings, because we will have like some dips and such. But one nice thing about the 3050 is that it actually got support for DLSS, and it's implemented into Warzone, so we can turn that on. So we are basically rendering at lower resolution, and I have now set it to like balanced performance, a good balance between visuals and performance. And what it does is like the GPU, or like it's learned to fill in the gaps, and then we see that we get still like good visuals but with good frame rates. It maybe doesn't look as good as true 1080p, but it's still a huge improvement in my mind. You can like play at good settings, really nice and smooth.
I'm off the
Taking down the settings a little bit to somewhat like high, we don't really see that huge of an improvement, but if we turn down the anti-aliasing from Filmic, we actually see a nice improvement up to 94% average, and then we are like basically playing at around 99 average FPS, which I think is a nice experience. And from like medium and turning it almost down to the lowest, we don't see that huge of an improvement either. Maybe we get a little bit more stable at high FPS in more demanding areas, as we see here when like fighting and such. But for me, I would maybe stay in medium, and if you want higher settings, maybe use DLSS. But we need to keep in mind that Warzone is a very demanding game, both for your GPU and CPU, because it's a big map with a lot of things to render and also a lot of things happening around the map. Going into Vanguard with the lowest settings, low preset, and render resolution at 66 with a 1050 Ti, we get an average at around 83 FPS. And if you turn on AMD FSR, this is actually really nice and playable, in my opinion at least. If we use the same settings with a 3050 We are running into a CPU bottleneck, so we get around 158 average, but we are limited there because of the CPU. We can see that the GPU was basically just running at around like 80 to 85% or so. Back to the 1050 Ti, running at the true resolution of 1080p, actually rendering 1080p, but then with all of the lowest settings we see that we just get an average of 54. So the average of 54 is like close to a smooth 60, but at these kinds of FPS we get drops and such, so it's not really a nice, enjoyable experience. Turning over to 3050, lowest settings, we can see that we are still running into a CPU bottleneck because I don't use a really high performing CPU for this test because I wanted to like mimic a nice budget system, but we see that we got a high like 158 average, but of course bottlenecked by the CPU. Turning up to 1080p medium, I will just test the 3050 because it's absolutely unplayable if we were to use 1050 Ti in medium 1080p, and we can see that we got 130 average on this like medium large bright map. But if we go into some really chaotic map like Das House and such, we will see FPS drops and such. So for me, I personally like to have it set in medium because it works well in all maps, but that maybe is because of like some optimizations and such, because ultra and high will work on these bigger maps with people more spread out and such. But if you go into like Das House with a lot of flares and such, the FPS really tanks a little bit in some situations and such. So overall, in every situation, medium works the best. But for example, on this map here, we see that we got a nice 120 FPS average, but it's the problem if you like go into, as I said earlier, Das House and such, high and ultra, you will see a lot of FPS drops and such. We can even see it here a little bit, but of course it gets much more worse when playing those maps. But otherwise, on these maps it's nice and playable though. So Forza Horizon doesn't really seem to be that heavy of a like running game, and we can see here playing in low, I still think it like looks decently, and we are running at render resolution at 1080p. We see that we get an average of 80 plus and such with a 1050 Ti, so it's still real nice and playable. Same settings on the 3050. We are like bottlenecked by the game. I was using my 4K monitor here, which have like a maximum of 144 Hz, and the game won't like render at unlimited frames, I think. So it like stopped there, so we would have over 144 Hz, but looking at the GPU utilization, I think we will maybe get the maximum of like 150 average or so, from both where the GPU was somewhat bottleneck and the CPU I think also was somewhere in that area where we wouldn't have gotten any better frames, even though it was rendering at an unlimited frame rate. And then also testing medium, and then high, and then ultra. I have to say all of these settings are real nice and enjoyable. Of course we will see some FPS drops when going up in visual quality, but even in ultra it's really nice and playable. It's not really too much more to say about this, so if you want to like play Forza Horizon with your 3050 at high settings in 1080p, I see no issues here. We get overall real nice performance, and the ray tracing is really not any demanding in this game as well. And you can also turn DLLS on if you like want to have it rendered on a bigger screen with a higher resolution. So I have done like the same benchmark run for each of these settings, but I have maybe cut out the video a little bit of different places, so always like the average won't really correspond to what's on the screen, but if you look at the screen you will get a nice overall look of how it's performing. But if you look to the average, it will go down a little bit towards the end of the run, because we are in a like more demanding area in the woods here and such. But still, even playing in ultra, I find it's a nice enjoyable experience. And if you want higher frame rates, you can set the performance down. So now let's testing in Flight Simulator 2020, which is a demanding game if you want good graphics, but compared to older simulators, flight simulators, it's still really nice, good performance with this 1050 Ti. You see that we get a lot of buildings, and we are like in a worst case scenario here in New York, flying over here, where we have to render a lot of buildings. We have a lot of other planes running around. I have some clouds here, but if we were to like turn up the weather even more, you will probably see a little bit lower frame rate. But we can see here, even with 1050 Ti running at low, it's not like the best visual quality, but compared to older simulators, this still looks very good, and it's very nice and playable with average of 36. So I could play with a 1050 Ti, not maybe for the visuals, but maybe more for actual simulator training. So moving on to the 3050, same settings, same area, and also clouds and such. We see that we get an like increase in two times more FPS. And when we get up to this level of like 75 FPS, you will never need any more frame rates, I guess, in a flight simulator. It also seems like looking in the MSI Afterburner, we can see that the GPU is actually not running at its full capability, or like actual performance there. And if you look into the built-in FPS performance meter in flight simulator, it's just all green. So I'm not sure if it's just capped out on this like kind of FPS, because even the main thread looks green here. So yeah, it just won't render at a higher frame rate, I guess. But moving on to the 1050 Ti 1080p, now on medium settings, same area. Maybe it looks like the cloud layer here is a little bit less, so we actually got a little bit more frame rates because of that. But now we see that we move into 24 FPS area, and this is marginal for a flight simulator. It's like playable, I have to say, but it's not like an overall good experience. But we see that we get some better visuals looking out of the window, going from low to medium. Overall, the outside world looks a little bit more real. And also keep in mind, if you are like flying in a more remote area, you will maybe have no issues playing with medium with the 1050 Ti, because that environment is not as demanding as this New York in this fairly big plane with a glass cockpit that also takes some frame rate with it. So if you are flying a smaller plane in a more remote area, you will definitely see much higher frame rates. But we could also see worse frame rate here if we were to turn up or have more weather. Yeah. So moving on from the 1050 Ti to the 3050 in medium, we went from average of like 24, and now we have an average of 59. And now it seems still that the CPU is the bottleneck here, and we can see that we got a nice visual quality here in medium, fairly good like render, and the world looks fairly real. And compared to the 1050 Ti, we have double the frame rates, and we also got some more weather rendering here that actually put on some more clouds and such. That also takes a little bit a hit on the performance, but overall you don't need more than this kind of frame rates. So we can set up the quality without any issues at all. And if we move on to high, we get an average of 45, and I'm really happy with this. We can see that the world here looks really good, and it's really big stepping stone what Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 have done when it compared to older simulators, when it compared to like visuals of the Earth and such itself. We basically have every building rendered in the world. Some are like from like photo satellite images or 3D scanning from airplanes, or some are like made from AI, out of just flat photography from like satellite images and such. But yeah, absolutely no problems running with high-end Flight Simulator 2020. And I think this is really good for the 3050, that we can get this kind of performance. Like trying to do this in X-Plane, it's not even possible to get close to the visual quality, and the frame rate would be much worse even with like 10 buildings in Manhattan in total. And if we move up to Ultra, we will see that the GPU is like mostly the limiting factor, I guess. And now we get a little bit worse experience with more frame dips and such. So it's still nice and playable in this area here. But if we start to move the airplanes and such, we get a little bit of like FPS drops and such. So for me, I would probably just leave it in high. But if you are playing in more remote areas, in not the biggest airplanes and such, I don't really see the issue in playing with Ultra. We need to keep in mind that this area here is the most demanding in the game, and if you have a bigger airplane with like interior with a glass cockpit, and what I mean by glass cockpit is a cockpit with like actual monitors for instruments, they for some reason hit the performance because they need more performance to like render those things and such. And also, if we turn up the weather a little bit to maybe see the impact of the performance here, we go from like an 40 FPS, of course we will have a little bit stutter, down to like 35 with a really nice cloud cover. But still, this is in Ultra, so I'm really pleasantly surprised of how well even the 3050 performs in this game here. If we want like a really good 1080p experience, you will probably need something like a 3060 or RX 6600. But still, if you don't mind, you will have a little bit lower FPS in some areas. Still a good card, I guess. So, in my opinion, the 3050 is absolutely worth its money if you can get it at a good price. But it's maybe more for new builders that is building a completely new PC and want to get into the PC world, and then maybe down the line upgrade to a better GPU. But if you have like a older 20 series or higher 10 series GPU, it's not really like a good upgrade, even though the price may be similar to what you had before. So it's geared towards the lower end 10 series cards to replace them, or the newcomers into the PC atmosphere. So yeah, thank you for watching this video.